This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Last week, Sony announced the brand new 50mm f1.4 G Master lens. I've had a preview copy for about a month now, and I've been very impressed with what I'm seeing. The image quality on this lens is absolutely outstanding. In fact, it's pretty much exactly what we've come to expect from any of the G Master lenses over the last couple years. So I do have one little test that I want to share with you, and this is a field curvature test. And if you want to know more about how to do these, I've got a whole video on them. You can do them on your own lenses. Essentially, you need a surface with texture, and you need to be able to put a point of focus right in the middle of the frame. You shoot the lens wide open. You get a pretty boring picture in this case of the street, but if I put it into Photoshop, I run it through the Find Edges filter, you can see exactly what is sharp in the frame and what is not. And when you do this with any lens, you can see one, edge-to-edge sharpness, and you can also see field curvature, and you can see that these are both outstanding and very acceptable on this lens. Other characteristics are outstanding as well. The bokeh is lush, it's exceptional. The autofocus is impressively fast. It meets all of the benchmarks that Sony has become known for in their top-of-the-line lenses. The most obvious place to start with any kind of comparison would be the 50mm f1.2 G Master, since these are now the two high-end choices that you have in Sony's lineup. It is worth mentioning that Sony did previously have a 50mm f1.4 lens, which was a co-design with Zeiss. And while that lens was very good, it was pretty early on in the Sony lineup, and it's just not up on the quality level that what Sony is able to produce today. So what we have now is a redesigned 50mm f1.4 lens that is up on spec with what Sony are capable of doing. It's also considerably lighter. Now, when we compare this new f1.4 lens with the f1.2 G Master, the most obvious differences are going to be size and weight, and also the diaphragm of the elements themselves. Surprisingly, however, the difference between the f1.4 and the f1.2 is very little, and this is actually a really big deal. Now, historically with lens design, the difference between an f1.2 and an f1.4 and even a 1.8 from any manufacturer was typically very vast, and a lot of this had to do with the fact that the materials that we were using back then, the methods of manufacturing, that were very different than what we've had just even in the last 10 to 15 years. Now, another thing that you're going to hear lens designers tell you is that when you're considering the maximum aperture for any lens, the wider that maximum aperture is, the aberrations that end up degrading that image increase exponentially. Each stop is about 4 times more difficult to correct. So for instance, if you have an f4 lens and you have an f2 lens, the difference between them is 2 stops. Well, that f2 lens is about 8 times more difficult to correct than the f4 was. So it becomes a numbers game, but needless to say, the wider the aperture, the more difficult it is to make a lens. The first f1.4 lens was actually a 50mm lens. It was made by Nikon in 1950. And you have to remember that back in 1950, film emulsions were much slower than they later became. It wasn't the same as what we have with digital technology today. So we were dealing with slower ISO speeds. We were dealing with smaller aperture lenses. 1.4 was a big deal, and this kind of kicked off the speed race. We ended up having f1.2 lenses after that, f1.1, f1.0, and then eventually Canon came out with their 0.95 50mm lens. It was kind of a crazy time for lens design. Back in those days, we did not have the same manufacturing techniques, the same materials, all the things that we have today in lens design. It was much different. And a lot of those really wide aperture lenses were designed for low light, and there was a big trade-off. For instance, the image quality suffered, but you had the wider aperture, so you could shoot in the lower light situations. In fact, I even remember in the 1980s and the 1990s, the general rule was if a company had a wider aperture of the same version of the lens, so let's say you had a 50mm f1.8, a 1.4, and an f1.2, you would want to buy the widest aperture and then stop it down. So in other words, the 1.2 lens performed better than the 1.4 at f1.4, and it performed better than the f1.8 at f1.8. Well, this is actually no longer the case, and with a lot of developments that we've seen from Canon, Nikon, and Sony in the last 15, maybe 20 years, it really has changed, and what we're seeing now is a completely different area. In fact, when we compare the f1.4 G Master to the f1.2 G Master, there really is very little difference. I can narrow it down to 3 things for you. It's going to be weight, price, and exactly 1/3 of a stop. Now, there are a handful of visual differences that you can see. The first is that at f1.2, you're going to have a shallower depth of field, and especially up close for things like portraits, it does give you a significantly different look. That depth of field becomes shallower the closer you get to the camera, so it's just a physics thing. It has a different look, and if that's the look that you're after, you're probably only going to get that on the 1.2 lens. The second notable difference is going to be in spherical highlights, or as the kids call them, bokeh balls. But if we look at the spherical highlights in the out of focus areas, you're going to see that the f1.2 is obviously going to be bigger because it's an f1.2 lens. But interestingly enough, if you compare both of these lenses at f1.4, and this is where it gets interesting, the bokeh is actually bigger still on the f1.2 lens. Now, you're probably sitting here thinking, no, how could this be? Is it not really an f1.4 lens? Is it actually shallower? What is going on? Well, I will tell you what's going on, and the mystery hides over in the cat's eyes. So if you look at the edge of the image, and we call these cat's eyes because they're no longer circular spherical highlights, they tend to form a cat's eye or oval shape, you're going to see that this effect is considerably less severe on the f1.2 lens. The reason this is it has to do with the diameter and the barrel design. The f1.2 is a bigger lens, and that's going to be the rule of thumb. If you want bigger bokeh, you're going to have to get a bigger lens. That's the trade-off. That's another reason why wide apertures just end up being bigger lenses in general. But I do want to say that if out of focus is your thing, if bokeh is your thing, if you want to do portraits and you want that creamy background, it's going to be slightly better on the f1.2 lens, even at f1.4, which is kind of an interesting takeaway. Now, after about f2.8, there is no visible difference in image quality in either one of these lenses. They're both outstanding. So this means it's going to come down to size and price for a lot of folks. Now, another thing that I want to note about lens reviews in general, and look, I'm guilty of this also, is that if we're just sitting here in a studio clinically talking about a lens, you might take the weight of both lenses and the size of both lenses and think, well, the f1.4 is not that much lighter. I can tell you, as someone who's carried this around and shot it, it is noticeably lighter. And for me personally, that means I'm going to actually shoot more, and I'm more inclined to carry the camera with me when I'm out and about. Like I said, it all depends on what type of photographer you are and what kinds of things you shoot and how you shoot, but that would be my opinion on the matter. Now, I actually want to compare the two lenses that we've been talking about with two other lenses, and these other two lenses are probably my two favorite 50mm lenses ever made. So we're talking about the Leica Summilux 50mm f1.4 ASPH, as well as the Zeiss Otus 55mm f1.4. These are two very different lenses. I know they're not native to mirrorless, but they are easily adaptable, and these are two of my favorite 50mm lenses ever made. They're very different. One is big and heavy, the other is lightweight and portable. So I want to talk about these in terms of image quality with the Sony lenses, but real quick, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor today, who are the awesome folks over at Squarespace.
Listen, you need a website, and we all know how much work that is to build and maintain, but it doesn't have to be. Squarespace is by far the easiest way to build your online presence. It's also the best way to grow a business that works for you without having to write a single line of code. Do you just need a simple portfolio or a blog to showcase your work? Well, Squarespace is perfect. Featuring a drag and drop interface. It's intuitive, it allows you to build galleries quickly and update your site with ease. Are you running a business? Well, Squarespace gives you additional tools for things like appointment scheduling, private member areas, social media tools, and even advanced email marketing. Do you sell products or services? Well, Squarespace has you covered with complete tools to power your store, from merchandising to checkout, so that you can sell, ship, and build your customer base. You can even sell classes or manage appointments through your website. And with Squarespace extensions, you can easily sync with third parties to manage, optimize, and enhance your website. From social media integration to SEO, Squarespace gives you all the tools you need to grow a business that works for you. So head over to Squarespace and sign up for the free trial. Start with one of their award-winning templates and see what you can create and just how good you're going to look. When you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/AOP and I can save you an additional 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Just use offer code AOP on checkout. So give it a try and see if Squarespace is right for you. And I want to give a special shout out and thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video.
So I do want to point out that I know this is a little bit of a weird comparison, and I'm really only talking about image quality. I believe that the Leica Summilux and even the Zeiss Otus are two of the best 50mm lenses ever made from an image quality standpoint. point. I realized that neither one of these lenses have autofocus. They're designed for different mounts. I did test all of these lenses with adapters were applicable on my A7R4, and so the playing field was sort of even in that regard, but I just want to talk about this because I think it's important to talk about the image quality aspect of what Sony are producing. I know there's a lot of talk about autofocus and speed of these lenses, and that all is important too, but the optical quality, I think, takes a backseat sometimes, and I want to show you just how good these are. So we'll start with the Leica 50mm Summilux Asph. One thing you need to understand about rangefinder lenses is there are size restrictions on the lenses, because when you shoot on a rangefinder, if the lens gets too big, you could block the viewfinder, which makes it very hard to compose, and if you don't have any size limits, you could potentially block the focusing mechanism. So with all of rangefinder lenses, you're going to find a trade-off in performance versus size. Leica are really interesting on this level because they give you outstanding performance in a really small package. One of the trade-offs with a small lens like this is there is a slight mid-frame fall off in resolution. You can see this when you look at this shot of the books. In the center of the frame, it's perfectly sharp. This is at f1.4 wide open. If we move over to the right-hand side, you can see that the resolution does have a drop. This is going to be a little bit subjective, but for me, this is part of the look. If you don't want that in your shot, the answer is to stop the lens down. But shooting it wide open has a very specific look that is absolutely beautiful. The bokeh transitions are probably my favorite of the four lenses here. It has a really interesting fall off. I know this is subjective, but to my eye, this is the standard for any 50mm lens, despite it not being absolutely perfect. In other words, we have a trade-off. It's not the sharpest lens here, but it probably has the most character, at least to my eyes. It is an absolute masterpiece in lens design. Now, the Zeiss Otus is a very different offering, and what's interesting is this lens was just introduced 10 years ago. This came out in 2013. The point I want to make on that is, as good as this lens is, it shows you how far we've come in the last 10 years. The problem that Zeiss had with the Otus series, these were all designed as DSLR mount lenses. Now, you can adapt them to mirrorless pretty easily. They're all manual focused, they're all really big, and they're really expensive. So a native DSLR lens at the price point these come in is pretty hard sell on photographers today. Then pretty much the entire industry is moving towards mirrorless. So I think, unfortunately, until there's a further development, we may have seen the last of the Zeiss Otus. However, these lenses are significant because they were designed with no budgetary restrictions, with no size restrictions. It was simply make the perfect lens in each one of these focal lengths. Therefore, this is the 55mm f1.4. It is based on a traditional design. It's a distagon design. It is absolutely fantastic. This, for me, ends up being a great studio lens, and that's what I use it for the most. It's going to give you slightly better performance than the Summilux. However, when you're not comparing the same image side by side, and this is important, you're probably not going to notice a difference between the two. And having said that, it's possible that I could use the Summilux for everything. Why do I own both? Well, I'm a lens nerd, and that's what happens. So now I want to show you a couple test shots that I did. Same composition, all four images side by side. I left the camera on the tripod, just changed the lenses out, so you can see some differences here. So the first notable difference that you're going to see is focal length. They're all slightly different. In fact, the Summilux is actually a 51.4mm. Leica are pretty vocal about that. The Zeiss is a 55. When you go out to a longer focal length, it makes it a little bit easier to make corrections and aberrations. And the Sonys are actually probably a little less than 50, probably a 48, 49, but it's pretty common for all lens manufacturers to, and it really makes no difference in real world shooting anyway. But if we consider the Zeiss and the Leica lenses, these are two lenses which represent the absolute height of lens design to the time that they were released. Both are classic lens formulas that add elements for additional correction. So the Summilux is a double gauze, the Zeiss is a distagon. Both feature floating element groups, which were pretty revolutionary in achieving sharp resolution at all focus distances. The Sonys, on the other hand, are complex lens formulas. These are very modern, they're very new, and they incorporate elements that just didn't exist until the last couple of years in lens design, like Sony's extreme sphericals, for instance. So with that in mind, how do I tell you what is the best performing lens out of here? And I think it's going to come down to a couple things that are really going to determine what lens is right for you, whether it's one of these four or whether it's another lens entirely. So if I had to pick one of these lenses here that we've looked at today that I was just going to shoot for the rest of my career, what would it be? Well, I think without question it would be the Leica Summilux, and there's a couple reasons why. I realize that it's a manual focus lens. That's fine for me. That might not be fine for you, but most importantly, this lens is the smallest. It's the most compact. And the reality is, the smaller and more compact a lens is, the more apt I am to have it with me at all times, and I'm ready to shoot. I'm just simply going to photograph more with this lens. It's a lens that, because of the ergonomic structure and a number of reasons why the manual focus is very intuitive on this lens, it's just right for me. It's designed for a rangefinder, but with the right adapter, you can pretty much put it on any camera system. I actually think that future-proofing is a very important quality for any lens. I know that if I can get an adapter, I can put it in front of a digital sensor, and that's going to last pretty much an infinite amount of time. One of the problems that I have with the mirrorless cameras that are being produced today, and this goes for Sony, it goes for Nikon, it goes for Fujifilm, it goes for Canon, it goes for everybody, is that there's so much of the lens that's dependent on electronic components that it makes you question, what if the mount changes one day? What if the technology changes one day? Are these lenses I could actually use on something in the next 20 or 30 years? And I think the answer on a lot of them is a big question mark. So while size and weight is pretty much the reason I would go with the Leica Summilux, my second choice in here on all four lenses that I've tested would be the Sony 50mm f1.4 G Master. It's an outstanding lens. There's a size trade-off with the f1.2. It's still small enough to carry around. It doesn't get too taxing after a while. Plus you get autofocus, and quite frankly, the resolution and the image quality is just better than the Summilux. The Summilux was designed in 2004. There's size restrictions. Side by side, would you notice a difference? It depends on your eyes and what you're looking for. You're probably not. But anyway, that being said, I think there's a tremendous amount of value that you get out of the 50mm G Master. I think Sony have hit a home run with this. I think the optics are outstanding. I know this was a long video to kind of prove that point, but I think they made a serious lens. If you guys have any questions, please drop them on the comments below. I'll see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.